Hello, so for today's lesson, our learning target is I can solve quadratic equations by completing the square. So sometimes we'll be given a quadratic equation that may be really difficult, almost impossible to factor. So if that happens to us, we have several options which we're going to explore over the next few days. But one of the best options is to solve the equation by completing the square. So let's start with an example. Suppose we have x squared plus 16x minus 13 is equal to 0. So first things first, let's see if we can factor this. So I'm going to open up another window on the desktop. What are our combos that multiply to negative 13? We could have 1 times negative 13 or negative 13 times 1. Those are our only options since 13 is a prime number. And we notice neither of those add up to 16. So our next step is, okay, we want to find another method of solving this problem. So let's try completing the square. So the first step of completing the square is actually to take our equation out of standard form and put it into the form ax squared plus bx is equal to c. So in order to do this, we're going to want to add 13 to each side. So now we have x squared plus 16x is equal to 13. So then our second step would be find b divided by 2 and square it. So in standard form and in our new form that looks like this, b is going to be the coefficient of the x to the first power term. So b is going to be 16. So we're going to open up another window on the desktop. We're going to say, okay, b over 2 is equal to 16 over 2, which is equal to 8. Then we're going to take 8 and we're going to square it, which is equal to 8 times 8, which is equal to 64. So now our third step would be we want to add b over 2 squared to each side of the equation. So now we're going to go back to our main equation. And we're going to have x squared plus 16x, and then we're going to have plus 64 is equal to 13 plus 64. So you see, again, to reiterate, we found what b divided by 2 is, which is 8. We squared it, and then we added it to each side. So now, the fourth step would be we want to factor the left side. So what do we notice about this? So we can factor this, since we have a 64 here. 64 is equal to 8 times 8, and 8 times 8 is also equal to 16. So you'll get x plus 8 times x plus 8 is equal to 77. And then we'll notice about this that x plus 8 times x plus 8 is equal to x plus 8 squared. So now our fifth step would be take square root of each side and solve for x. So the square root of x plus 8 squared is equal to the square root of 77. And then the square root of x plus 8 squared, if we take the square root of something, we're just reversing the square process, so we'll get x plus 8 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 77. And then, in order to solve for x, we just subtract 8 from each side, and we get x is equal to negative 8 plus or minus square root of 77. So we are unable to simplify this square root any further, so this would be an acceptable form to leave our answer in, although we have two answers. We have the positive case and we have the negative case. Or we can plug it into our calculator. So if I do that, we get negative 8 plus square root of 77 is going to be equal to .77, or we could also get negative 8 minus square root of 77, negative 16.77. So, as with all quadratic equations, we're often going to have two real solutions. So, let's just recap the steps one more time. So our first step is we want to put our equation in the form ax squared plus bx is equal to c. Then we want to find what b over 2 is and square it. This is kind of a side step. Then we go back to our original equation. We add b over 2 squared to each side. Then we factor the left side. And notice, I want to add something here, which is that your factorization for the left side is always going to look like x plus b over 2 squared. And this is not just a coincidence. This is strategic. The reason that we add b over 2 squared to each side is exactly so that we get this really nice perfect square here. And then when we take the square root, it's very easy. So after we factor the left side, which is always going to be a perfect square, we'll take the square root of each side and solve for x, which we did in this step. So now let's do another example. So let's say we have x squared minus 20x plus 4 is equal to 0. So again, our first step, let's see if we can factor this, because that's generally the most desirable way to solve a quadratic equation if it is feasible. So our combos that multiply to positive 4, we have a positive here and a negative here. So we have negative 1 times negative 4 and negative 2 times negative 2. So big surprise, neither of those add to negative 20. So our next step is, okay, we're going to try to solve this by completing the square. So we're going to subtract 4 from each side. We're going to get x squared minus 20x is equal to negative 4. And And then we're going to say, okay, we're going to open up another window on the desktop. We're going to say, okay, so b is equal to negative 20. B over 2 is thus equal to negative 10. And b over 2 squared, so negative 10 times negative 10, which is equal to 100. So what that tells us is, hey, we need to add 100 to each side. So I'm going to get x squared minus 20x plus 100 is equal to negative 4 plus 100. So if we factor this side, we're going to get x minus 10 times x minus 10, because remember, we're always going to get x plus b over 2 squared, and b over 2 is equal to negative 10. We're going to get that's equal to 96. Now our next step is we want to take the square root of each side. So we get x minus 10 squared is equal to 96. Square root of each side. So we get x minus 10 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 96. And then if we add 10 to each side, we get 10 plus or minus the square root of 96. So here, in the last case, we were done at this step. But what we notice about 96 is it's not a perfect square, but we can simplify it. We can break it down like we did in the last lesson. So you notice that 16 times 6, I'm going to use a different color. You notice that 16 times 6, that's equal to 36, 3, is equal to 96. So that means that we can write this as 10 plus or minus square root of 16 times 6, which that's equal to 10 plus or minus the square root of 16 times the square root of 6. Square root of 16 is 4, so we get our final answer is 10 plus or minus 4 times the square root of 6, and this would be the answer, our most simplified answer, which I'd like to see on homework and tests. And additionally, we could plug this into our calculator and see what we got. But this is, in general, the method for solving equations by completing the square. So it takes a little bit of practice to get the method down, but once you know what steps to take, it's generally a pretty smooth and enjoyable way of solving quadratic equations. So you notice that if our b term is an odd number instead of an even, we would get a fraction here, because b over 2 would be a fraction. So generally we want to stick to using completing the square to solve quadratic equations that have an even b term. So in our next lesson, we're going to learn how to solve quadratic equations using the quadratic formula, which is yet another way that we can use to solve equations that might be really nasty to solve using either factoring or completing the square. So stay tuned for that.